7 minutes past 6 in the morning. The light goes out. The light goes out. By the time the sun clears the ridge of Penobscot Bay, there is nothing left of it. Just an old white tower on a granite headland, the sea below, the early November sky coming up grey behind the pines, and one man standing at the top of the lighthouse, watching. His name is Arthur Hale. He is 70 years old, and he has been standing in this exact spot, doing this exact thing, every single morning for 30 years. This is his story. Arthur's hands are the hands of a man who has worked outdoors for 40 years. Rope calloused, salt dried. There is a scar along his left thumb from a mooring cleat that bit him badly in the winter of 1997. He moves carefully on the iron stairs, not because he is frail, but because the stairs are wet this time of year. And he has learned, at 70, that the floor is much further away than it used to be. He has been doing this for 30 years. He took the job in 1994. The lighthouse had been decommissioned the decade before. The Coast Guard had put an automated light buoy 3 miles offshore and decided the old stone tower on the headland was redundant. The town of Millhaven, Maine kept it on the books as a heritage structure, technically maintained, practically forgotten. The posting paid $900 a month plus utilities. Nobody applied. Nobody wanted to live at the end of a gravel road, alone, in a building that served no official purpose, maintaining a light that the charts no longer marked as active. Arthur applied. The town's harbour master, a man named Roy Dunleavy, who had worked with Arthur for 16 years, called him up the day the paperwork came through. He said, "You don't have to do this, Art." Arthur said, "I know." That was the end of the conversation. Every morning begins the same way. Downstairs in the small kitchen attached to the lighthouse base, Arthur fills the kettle. The kitchen is clean, but not tidy. There is a difference. The dishes are washed and stacked, the floor swept, but on every surface, the accumulated objects of a life lived in one place for a very long time. A barometer on the windowsill that Arthur hasn't trusted since 2011, but has never thrown away. A stack of tide tables going back 12 years. A coffee tin full of pencils. Always pencils, never pens, because pens freeze in the winter and run dry in the salt air. He makes coffee in a chipped green thermos he has owned since 1989. The lid no longer seals perfectly. He wraps a rubber band around it to keep it from leaking on the walk up the stairs. He has done this every morning for so long that the rubber band has worn a faint groove in the lid. Before he drinks the coffee, he takes down the weather log. Volume 31. A composition notebook filled end to end in pencil. He opens it to yesterday's entry, the habit of checking the previous day before recording today's. Then he picks up a pencil, writes the date in the top corner of a fresh line, and begins. Barometric pressure, wind direction, cloud cover, the state of the water. He does this every morning, before coffee, before anything else. He has done it every morning for 30 years. By the hook, beside the front door, hang 3 children's coats. They are small, child-sized, arranged in order of descending size from left to right. The largest, a navy blue anorak, the kind boys wore in the late 90s, hood trimmed in orange synthetic fur that has gone flat with age. The middle, a red coat, double-breasted, with wooden toggle buttons. One button is missing, replaced with one of a slightly different shade of red, close enough to pass 20 years ago. The smallest, an olive-green zip-up with a white stripe down both sleeves, the kind that was fashionable for about 2 years in the mid-2000s. They have been on that hook for a long time. The sleeves are dusty. The colors have gone pale in the way fabric fades when it is never worn, but never washed either. Bleached slightly by years of light from the south-facing window, the texture gone soft and weightless, like old paper. They are too small for anyone who might walk through that door today. Arthur walks past them every morning without stopping. He has never taken them down. Not in 30 years. We will come back to those coats. Eleanor Hale died in the spring of 1993. She was 39 years old. She and Arthur had been married for 11 years, and they had wanted children for most of those 11 years. In February of 1993, it had finally happened. They painted the second bedroom. Arthur built a crib from a kit, badly. Eleanor fixed the joints and didn't tell him until years later. The baby came early. Arthur drove her to the hospital at 3 a.m. in a sleet storm. He sat in a waiting room chair for 9 hours. At 20 minutes past noon, a doctor he had never met came through a door and said words that Arthur has never repeated, not to anyone, not in 30 years. He drove home alone in the early afternoon. The sleet had stopped. He stood in the kitchen for a long time. Then he went and sat in the second bedroom, in the rocking chair Eleanor had bought at an estate sale, and he sat there until it was dark outside. He did not go back to the coastal rescue crew. He applied for the Lighthouse posting. He took the job. He moved to the end of a gravel road in a building that served no official purpose, and he kept the lamp burning, the way he had always kept things, steadily, without being asked, without recognition, without stopping. He called it Eleanor's lamp. That is all there is to say about that. The first child arrived in the spring of 1998. Arthur did not go looking for him. He was not a man with a plan. He was not thinking about children or family or what the second bedroom had become in the 5 years since he had last opened its door. He was simply a man who went up the stairs in the morning and came down in the evening and kept the lamp running on a light that nobody had asked him to keep running. He noticed the boy the way he noticed weather, because it was there and because it was wrong. The boy sat on the rock ledge every afternoon, a long flat shelf of granite that juts out from the base of the headland 30 feet below the lighthouse, in April, on a school day, in a raw northeast wind with the temperature barely above 40 degrees. Arthur noticed him on a Tuesday, then again on Wednesday. By the end of the second week, the boy had been there every single afternoon, a thin figure in a grey sweatshirt, feet dangling over the water, not moving, not fishing, not doing anything at all, just watching the sea. Arthur knew that look. He had worn it himself for the better part of a year after Eleanor died. Not grief exactly, something more specific. The look of a person searching the surface of the water for something they know, logically, is not going to appear. Watching anyway, because stopping feels like a second loss. He did not go down and introduce himself. He did not call the school or the social services office. He went inside, made 2 mugs of cocoa, the instant kind from a tin he kept for winters, and he carried them down the path and along the granite and sat down beside the boy without saying anything. He held out the second mug. The boy looked at it. Then he took it. They sat there for 40 minutes looking at the water. Arthur did not ask the boy's name. The boy did not offer it. When the light started to go out of the sky, Arthur stood up, took his empty mug, and walked back up to the lighthouse. He came back the next afternoon with 2 mugs, and the afternoon after that. On the 3rd week, the boy spoke. He said, "Do you know the Mary Kathleen?" Arthur did know the Mary Kathleen. It was a 32-foot lobster boat out of Millhaven Harbour, registered to a man named Patrick Cole. Patrick Cole had gone out on the 12th of March in a storm that the forecast had underestimated, and had not come back. The Coast Guard searched for 4 days. They found the boat capsized 11 miles offshore. They did not find Patrick Cole. The sea in March in Maine is 38 degrees. It had been 10 days. Arthur said the name quietly, the Mary Kathleen, Patrick Cole's boat. The boy nodded. They kept watching the water. The boy's name was Daniel Cole. He was 8 years old. His father had been the fisherman. His mother had left Millhaven 2 weeks after the search was called off. No note, no forwarding address, no arrangement made. Daniel had been staying with a neighbor, then at a group home 40 minutes away. He came back to the ledge every afternoon because the group home van dropped the kids at the library on weekdays, and the ledge was a 20-minute walk from the library. He walked it every single day. Arthur drove to the county foster care office the following Monday. He sat across from a caseworker named Linda Marsh. She looked at Arthur, 60 years old, single, living alone in a lighthouse on a municipal maintenance contract, with the careful, professionally neutral expression of a person who has learned to be honest without being cruel. She said, "Mr. Hale, I want to be straightforward with you." She was. The system was not designed to place a child with a single man living alone in a structure classified as a municipal utility building. The bedroom had a window that did not meet current ventilation code. The kitchen had no second means of egress. The nearest school was 11 miles away on a road that was sometimes impassable in January. "It's not impossible," she said, "but it will take time, and it will take work." Arthur said, "Tell me what needs to be done." It took 11 months. He hired a contractor, applied for variances from the building department, documented road conditions using his own weather log, arranged for school bus service. He did all of this while continuing to tend the lighthouse, write the log, oil wipe the brass housing, and make coffee in the thermos with the rubber band around the lid. Every Saturday, he drove the 40 minutes to the group home. He brought bread he had baked himself, a dense, dark loaf. He was not a good baker at first. By the 4th or 5th attempt, the results were, if not exactly good, at least consistent. For 7 visits, Daniel received him with the careful, watchful courtesy of a boy who has learned not to expect things to last. Polite, contained, answering only what was asked. On the 8th visit, Arthur came up the front walk, and Daniel was already at the door. Not waiting on the porch, inside the door, through the glass panel, standing there. Nobody had called him. Nobody had told him what time Arthur was coming. He was just there, with his shoes on. He held out a piece of paper when Arthur came in. It was a drawing. A child's drawing, careful but inexpert, the proportions not quite right, the perspective slightly off in the way that an 8-year-old's perspective will be. A lighthouse on a headland above water. In the bottom corner, in careful childish printing. For Arthur. Not for Mr. Hale, Arthur. Arthur looked at the drawing for a long moment. He folded it carefully. He opened his wallet. He put it inside, behind the library card he never used. He closed the wallet and put it back in his pocket. He kept that piece of paper in his wallet for 20 years. The second child arrived in the fog, and did not come with a name. It was early June of 2001, a Thursday morning, before 6 o'clock. Arthur was up in the lantern room checking the mechanism after switching off the lamp when he heard the sound below, a low grinding scrape of hull against rock. Then silence. Then the water settling. He went to the railing. A small open boat had drifted onto the rocks at the base of the headland. fiberglass hull, no running lights, no one at the tiller. He got down the stairs and the path, and the Granite scrambled to the waterline faster than was probably wise at his age. He got to the bow and looked in. A girl, 6 years old perhaps, small-boned, dark-haired, sitting with her arms wrapped around her own knees, looking up at him. She was not wet, she was not bleeding, she was not crying. She did not say anything. Arthur said, "It's all right, I've got you." He did not know if she understood him. She looked at him with the flat, careful look of a child who has been still for a very long time and has decided that stillness is the safest way to be. He reached into the boat and lifted her out onto the rocks. She weighed almost nothing. There were no papers in the boat, no bag, no identifying documents of any kind. The boat had no registration numbers. They had been removed, sanded away cleanly. Whoever had put her in that boat had done it with care, and had not wanted her to be traceable. Nobody ever came forward. The caseworker who handled her case gave her a name for the paperwork, Iris. The surname was assigned as a placeholder, Iris Doe, on the first filing. Later, when Arthur eventually became her guardian, and later still when the adoption was finalized, she became Iris Hale. 3 days after Iris was taken to the group home, Arthur drove there. Nobody had called him. The caseworker looked up and said, "Can I help you?" Arthur said, "I'm Arthur Hale. I found the girl, the one from the boat." The caseworker said, "Do you know this child?" Arthur said, "Not yet, but I would like to." He drove 60 kilometers every Sunday. He talked to Iris the way he talked to the water in the morning, steadily, without requiring a response, because the talking was its own thing and did not depend on being answered. He told her about the weather. He told her about the fish he had seen from the lantern room that week. He told her that the color of the water today was different from yesterday, and different again from last week, and that if she looked at it long enough, she could learn to read the color the way you read a clock. Not exactly, but close enough. She listened. He was certain of that, even when she gave him nothing back. There was a quality to her attention that was not the blankness of a child who has shut down. It was more like the quality of a person who is taking careful notes in a language they are only beginning to understand. He spoke as though she understood everything. It was the only thing he knew how to do. In the 7th month, Arthur was up in the lantern room replacing a worn bearing on the rotation mechanism. He had the lamp turning slowly to test the repair. He was concentrating. But he was always aware of where Iris was. She was looking up at the lamp. And then, quietly, without preamble, she said, "It's pretty when it spins." Arthur went still. He did not turn around immediately. He kept his hands on the housing. He was afraid that if he moved too quickly, something would close. He had learned in 7 months that Iris opened the way a tide pool opens, slowly, only when the conditions were exactly right, and not to be forced. He looked up at the lamp. He said, "Yeah, Eleanor always liked it too." It was the first time he had said Eleanor's name out loud to another person since the doctor came through that door in 1993. He had not planned to say it. It was simply what came out, the way the true thing comes out when you are not braced against it. Iris looked at him. Then she looked back up at the turning lamp. He did not cheer. He did not call anyone. He simply finished the job he was doing, slowly, carefully, while the lamp turned above them both. The third child did not arrive. He was found. It was the summer of 2004. Arthur was 60 years old. Daniel was 14. Iris was 9. Arthur was not thinking about a third child. He was walking back from the harbor at 2 in the morning. called down by Roy Dunleavy to help secure a mooring line that parted in a wind shift, when he saw the light under the hull of the Agnes Ruth, a 38-foot sloop, a boat whose owner was not anywhere near Millhaven at this time of year. The light was moving, a headlamp, and there was sound, the irregular metal sound of someone working on an engine. He walked down the dock and looked under the stern. A boy was lying on his back in the bilge area, his upper half concealed by the engine housing, working by headlamp on what Arthur could see. Even from the dock was a seized cooling pump. His tools were laid out on a clean piece of cloth beside him, not scattered, not random, laid out with care. He was not supposed to be on this boat. He had no permission. He had climbed aboard a vessel he did not own, in the middle of the night, and he was fixing an engine that was not his problem. Arthur said, "Do you know what you're doing?" The boy did not look up. He said, "Better than you think." Arthur stood on the dock for a moment. Then he stepped down into the cockpit and sat on the stern bench. He said, "Show me." The boy looked out from under the engine housing then, a quick, measuring look. The look of a person assessing whether something is a trap. He was 14 years old, angular, watchful, a face that had learned early to give nothing away. Then he went back to the pump. They worked until 4 in the morning. When Marcus set the last bolt and sat up and wiped his hands on the cloth, Arthur said, "Where do you need to be?" Marcus named the group home, the facility of last resort in this part of the state, the place where children went when 3 placements had failed, and the county was running out of options. Arthur said, "I'll drive you." Marcus said, "You don't have to." Arthur said, "I know." The caseworker who handled Marcus's file said, "Mr. Hale, you already have 2 children." Arthur said, "I know." She said, "This boy has a difficult file. 3 placements in 4 years. The word the last family used was impossible." Arthur said, "People say that about things they haven't figured out yet." He appeared before the board 3 times. For the 3rd hearing, he did not bring more documents. He brought Daniel and Iris. Daniel was 15. Iris was 12. They sat beside Arthur in the hearing room, and when the board chair asked if they had anything to say, they said it. Arthur had not coached them. He told them they could speak if they wanted, or not if they didn't. He told them it was their home too. Iris said, "There's a room, it's empty. Marcus could have it." Daniel said, "I know what it's like to have nowhere. I'd rather he had somewhere." That was all. The approval came through 6 weeks later. Marcus ran away once. He was 16. It was October. Arthur came back from the lamp check and Marcus was gone. No note, just his jacket missing. And his tools. The small canvas roll he had arrived with, the one he added to carefully over time, gone. Arthur stood in Marcus's room for a moment. Then he went downstairs and made coffee and wrote the morning log. He did not call the police. That night he switched the lamp on at the usual time and ran it through the night. The second night, the same. On the 3rd night, Daniel came downstairs and said, "You're not going to look for him?" Arthur said, "No." Daniel said, "Why not?" Arthur said, "Because he knows the way back. I just need to keep the light on." On the 3rd night, around 2 in the morning, there were footsteps on the gravel outside. The door opened. Marcus came in. He was cold. His jacket wasn't enough for 3 nights in October in Maine, and his face showed it. He stood in the kitchen and looked at Arthur. Arthur got up and put the kettle on. Marcus said, "Why didn't you come looking?" Arthur said, "Because you know the way back. I just needed to keep the light on." A long silence. The kettle was loud in the quiet. Marcus said, That's either very smart or very stupid. Arthur said maybe both. Marcus sat down at the table. He never ran away again. Years later, on the night before Marcus left for college, they sat together on the bench outside the cottage in August. The water flat and dark, the lamp running. Marcus said, "You kept the light on when I ran." Arthur said, "Yes." Marcus said, "I saw it from the road." He did not say anything else about it. He did not need to. The years do not arrange themselves neatly. That is the first thing to say about raising 3 children in a lighthouse on a gravel road 11 miles from town. There is no clean sequence of lessons learned and wisdom earned. There is Tuesday, and then there is Wednesday. There is the log written in the morning, and the lamp checked in the evening, and the meals made in between. And inside all of that, threading through it, not separate from it, 3 children growing up. Daniel skipped school, sometimes, not recklessly, just on the days when the water changed color, and something in him went still and then went elsewhere. Arthur drove to the ledge the first time, stood beside him, then drove him back to school. The second time, he just stood there, didn't make him go back. An hour in, Daniel said, "Aren't you going to make me go?" Arthur said, "What would you do there that you can't do here?" After that, when Daniel needed the ledge, he went to the ledge, and Arthur left it alone. Iris talked in her sleep, in a language Arthur had never heard, not the Romance languages, not the Germanic ones, not anything he could place. Whatever it was hers. Possibly the first thing she had ever had that was entirely hers. He did not wake her. He did not ask about it in the morning. He went to the kitchen and made a cup of tea and carried it back and set it on the nightstand beside her bed. It would be cold by the time she woke up. That was all right. It was not about the tea. Some things, Arthur had come to understand, are smaller if you name them. Money was always tight. $900 a month, raised once to $1,100, after Roy Dunleavy argued at a town meeting that the lighthouse was worth more to the harbor than the pay reflected. Arthur never told the children how tight. But they knew. They never asked for things he didn't have. This, too, was a kind of language. Daniel left first. He was 18. He had applied, without telling Arthur until he was accepted, to a marine engineering program at a state university 4 hours south. He sat Arthur down at the kitchen table on a Wednesday evening and put the acceptance letter between them and waited. "Arthur, read it again." He said, "Marine engineering." Daniel said, "Yes." Arthur said, "That's a good program." Daniel said, "It is." That was the whole conversation. But that evening, without anything being said, Arthur made the dinner that meant things were all right, the good bread, the fish chowder, the kind that took most of the afternoon. Iris set the table with the cloth they only used on important occasions. Marcus washed the dishes afterward without being asked. Daniel left in September with 2 bags and a thermos Arthur pressed on him at the last moment, an old green one he had kept in the cabinet for years. Daniel took it without argument. Iris left 2 years later, pre-law, which surprised no one who had watched her read. She hugged Arthur at the door, briefly, firmly, the hug of a person who has learned late what hugs are for and treats them accordingly. On the morning she left, she stood in the kitchen while Arthur made coffee, and she said, "Will you keep talking to the water?" Arthur looked at her. He said, "I expect so." She nodded, as though this settled something. Marcus stayed the longest. He was 20 when he left. Financial investigations, 2 states away. A path that surprised everyone. Until you thought about it, he had always been a person who noticed when something was wrong before he could say why. who followed irregularities the way he had followed engine problems, backward through the sequence of causes, until he found the one that had started it all. After Marcus left, the lighthouse was quiet in the way it had been before 1998. Fully quiet. On the hook by the door, the three coats stayed where they were. The letter arrived on a Thursday in February. Arthur almost did not notice it. The important things in his life had mostly arrived in person. A boy on a rock ledge, a girl in a boat, a teenager under an engine in the dark. He was not a man who expected important things to come by mail. The envelope was legal-sized, the return address, a law firm in Portland, Hargrove and Associates. He opened it at the kitchen table with his coffee. He read it twice. Then he set it down and looked out the window at the water for a long time. The letter informed him, in the careful language that legal correspondence uses to make ordinary things sound both inevitable and already decided, that his occupancy of the Lighthouse property at 14 Headland Road, Millhaven, Maine, was subject to a civil claim filed by Hargrove Development LLC. The town of Millhaven had, in the previous October, transferred the property under a development agreement to Hargrove Development. He was requested to vacate. April 15th, 61 days away. Arthur read the letter a third time. Then he folded it back into the envelope and put it on the shelf above the counter, between the barometer he did not trust and the stack of tide tables, and he went up to check the lamp. He thought about calling them. He stood at the kitchen counter that evening and looked at the phone and thought, with some clarity, about each call he would have to make. Daniel, in the middle of a large harbor assessment project, working 18-hour days. Iris, recently promoted, managing her own cases now. Marcus, 3 months into an investigation he could not describe in detail, but which had, from the little he said, the weight of something important. He told himself they had their own lives. This was true. He also told himself it would probably come to nothing. He was less certain this was true. The real reason, underneath both of those, was the one he did not examine directly. He was afraid of being a burden. He had spent 30 years not being a burden. The idea of calling his children and saying, "I need help," had the particular difficulty of a thing that has never been done before, and therefore has no established shape. He put the phone down. He found a lawyer. Her name was Beverly Okafor. She had been practicing general law in Millhaven for 22 years. At the end of their first meeting, she looked at Arthur steadily and said, "The transfer was processed through the town's property disposal mechanism for surplus municipal assets. Your contract is a maintenance agreement, not a lease. Without a formal contract with protected tenancy, and with $280,000 on the other side of the table, your odds are not good." Arthur said, "What are my odds?" She said, "I don't like to give odds, but I want you to know what you're walking into." He thanked her. He drove home. He sat at the kitchen table for a while. Then he went to the closet and found a box. He began to pack. He was standing in the front room. One day before the handover deadline, the boxes were stacked in the corner, 11 of them. The walls were lighter where pictures had been removed. The shelves were thinner. The kitchen stripped of the accumulated objects that had made it, slowly and without intention, a particular kitchen rather than just a kitchen. The lamp was running. He had told himself he would switch it on every night until he could not. The 3 coats were still on the hook. Everything else was packed, but the coats were still on the hook, because he had not been able to reach that part of the packing yet, or had not reached it. or had found each evening when he thought about it, that there was something else to do first. He stood in front of them for a long time. He reached up. His hand was on the sleeve of the navy blue anorak, Daniel's coat, the oldest one, when he heard the footsteps on the stone path outside. Not one set. Several. A knock at the door. He opened it. Daniel stood on the step with a backpack on his shoulder, and his jacket damp at the collar from the sea fog. He was 30 years old, tall, with his father's fisherman's hands. Behind him, Iris. She had driven. She had the keys in her hand, and the particular composed expression she wore, when she had prepared for something, when she had thought it through far enough that she was not going to be surprised. Behind her, at the back, Marcus. He was holding a cardboard box, in it a loaf of bread, several tins, a bottle of something. He was standing slightly to one side of the path, looking in, the way he had looked through windows as a boy, assessing whether the space inside was one he was allowed to enter. Arthur stood in the open door and looked at the three of them. He said, "How did you know?" Daniel said, "Marcus found the court filing in the public record system last week." Arthur said, "Why didn't you say something sooner?" It was Iris who answered. She said, "We needed time to prepare, and so did you. You needed enough time that you wouldn't turn us away at the door." Arthur stood there. He looked at the three of them. He looked back at the hook, where the three coats still hung, where his hand had been a moment ago. He looked at them again. Daniel with the fog on his collar, Iris with the car keys, Marcus at the edge of the light, holding a box of groceries. He stepped aside and let them in. They worked at the kitchen table. That is the simple version of what happened in the 3 weeks between the night they arrived and the first hearing date. Daniel's laptop on the left side. Iris on the right. Legal pads, printed documents. A copy of Maine Property Law in a binder she had ordered overnight. Marcus in the middle, his materials spreading gradually until they occupied whatever space the other two had momentarily vacated. Arthur cooked. He made the things he knew how to make. The chowder, the bread, the bean soup that took most of the day. He refilled the cups without being asked. He washed the dishes at midnight so the morning started clean. Occasionally, when one of them leaned back from the table and rubbed their eyes and looked at the ceiling, he would say something. Not about the case, about the lighthouse. In February of 2009, the fog was so thick for 6 days straight that I ran the lamp continuously, not the night cycle all day, around the clock. There is no official record of that. The winter of 2003, a trawler lost its GPS and its radio in the same storm. They were navigating by the lighthouse beam for 4 hours. The captain sent a letter afterward. I have it somewhere. Daniel wrote all of it down. Daniel started with the official record. What existed in the public domain? Town maintenance reports, Coast Guard logs. What he found was this. The official record was thin, not falsified, not erased, simply thin. The way records get thin when a thing has been quietly functional for so long that no one has thought to document it carefully. He worked through Arthur's maintenance logs, all 31 volumes in sequence. He made a table. Column 1, Date 2, Weather and Sea Conditions. Column 3, Light Status. Column 4, Any activation outside the standard schedule. Any instance of Arthur switching the lamp on because someone in the water needed it, not because the schedule required it. He found 47 of those instances in 30 years. 47 times that Arthur had seen a vessel in difficulty and switched the lamp on, without being asked, without authorization, without any formal mechanism that would cause this to appear in any official record anywhere. A lobster tender in the fog, a sailboat losing steerage in a squall, a kayaker once, who should not have been that far offshore, 47 times, recorded each time in Arthur's pencil handwriting. Small vessel, uncertain heading, activated beam 7-1, vessel corrected course, beam secured 0748. Never embellished, never editorialized. Just the fact of it, because leaving it out would have made the log incomplete. Beverly Okafor, when Daniel presented the table, was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "This is the case." Iris found Carol Marsh, a 61-year-old public land lawyer who had argued before the Maine Supreme Judicial Court 4 times, won 3, was sufficiently right in the 4th that the legislature subsequently changed the law. Carol Marsh drove to Millhaven and sat at Arthur's kitchen table and asked him a series of questions in the careful, unhurried manner of someone who already knows roughly what the answers will be, but wants to hear them in the subject's own words. She asked, "How long have you operated the lamp outside the standard schedule?" Arthur said, "Whenever someone needed it." She asked, "Did you ever seek reimbursement?" Arthur said, "No." She asked, "Why not?" Arthur was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because it was just what needed to be done. I didn't think it required a form." Carol Marsh wrote something in her notebook. She said, "Mr. Hale, your 30 years of uncompensated, undirected maritime service to this community, documented in your own hand every single day, is the legal argument. You have been operating an active aid to navigation continuously and without interruption since 1994. That makes this lighthouse a functioning maritime facility under Maine's Coastal Preservation Statute, regardless of what the Coast Guard's classification says." She closed her notebook. "I'd like to take the case." Meanwhile, Iris had been pulling another thread. She found it in the financial disclosure forms. Mayor Gerald Calloway's wife held a 23% ownership stake in a limited liability company called Coastline Partners Group. Coastline Partners Group held a 41% stake in Hargrove Development, LLC. The mayor had chaired the meeting at which the Lighthouse transfer was voted through. Under Maine's municipal ethics statute, a chair was required to disclose any financial interest in a matter before the body. The minutes recorded no such disclosure. She called Marcus into the kitchen. He looked at the diagram she had drawn for about 30 seconds. He said he voted on the transfer. Iris said he chaired the meeting. Marcus said, and he didn't disclose. Iris said, "You might be able to establish whether it was deliberate. I can't." Marcus took the legal pad. He opened his laptop. He worked for 11 days. On the 12th day, he had what he needed. 63 pages of documentation, mapping the ownership chain, the timeline of the property, alongside the timeline of that interest, the pattern of municipal approvals across 3 towns. He submitted it to the State Attorney General's office through the formal public disclosure mechanism. He told them, "This is what I found. I am making no allegation. I am making a disclosure. What you do with it is your business." Then he went to sleep for the first time in 4 days. Arthur attended every hearing. He sat in the front row, always the front row, always the same seat, with Daniel on his left and Marcus on his right. He wore the brown jacket he wore to anything that required a jacket. He did not speak in the courtroom. Carol Marsh worked without theatrics. She did not raise her voice. She presented the documents in sequence and explained what each document showed and moved to the next. She had the quality of a person who is entirely confident, not because they have won before, but because they have prepared to the exact point where surprise is no longer possible. Arthur observed this quality in her. He recognized it. He had seen it in Iris. In the fourth hearing, Carol Marsh placed all 31 volumes of the weather log on the table before the court in sequence. She did not make a speech about them. She opened the most recent volume to that morning's entry. Arthur had written it before they left for the courthouse, as he wrote it every morning, because not writing it would have been a larger statement than he intended, and she handed it to the judge. She said, "Your Honor, this entry was written this morning. The entry before it was written yesterday. Every entry in this volume, and in each of the 30 volumes preceding it, was written on the date it records, without exception, for 30 consecutive years. Volume 1 begins on March the 3rd, 1994. This morning's entry is the 10,958th consecutive daily entry." The judge, a methodical woman named Judge Renata Solis, looked at the log entry. She turned a few pages. She looked at Arthur. She said, "Mr. Hale, you've maintained this log every day for 30 years?" Arthur said, "Yes, Your Honor." She said, "In pencil?" He said, "Pens freeze in the winter and run dry in the salt air." Judge Solis looked at the log for another moment. She said, "Counsel, let's continue." The ruling came on a Tuesday morning in April. Carol Marsh received it electronically and called Arthur at 10 past 10, while he was up in the lantern room doing the morning check. He came down and called her back from the kitchen. She read him the operative sections. Her voice was the same voice she used for everything, measured without inflation. The civil suit brought by Hargrove Development LLC was dismissed with prejudice. The Lighthouse property at 14 Headland Road, Millhaven, Maine, was formally designated a functioning historic maritime facility under the state's Coastal Preservation Statute. The designation was permanent and precluded acquisition of the property for commercial development in perpetuity. The town of Millhaven was ordered to execute, within 30 days, a formal employment contract with Arthur Hale for the position of lighthouse keeper. A real contract, with a salary, with health insurance, with the terms that should have existed 30 years ago, and had not because no one had thought to insist on them, and Arthur had not been the kind of man to insist. Arthur stood at the kitchen counter and listened. When Carol finished reading, he said, "Thank you." She said, "The log did it, Arthur. 30 years of pencil handwriting, that's what did it." He said, "I'll write it in the log." She laughed, a brief, genuine sound, the laugh of a person who has won something that was worth winning. He hung up. He stood in the kitchen for a moment. Then he opened the log to that morning's entry, and at the bottom, below the barometric pressure and the wind direction and the state of the water, he wrote 3 words in pencil: "Designation confirmed, permanent." The morning after the ruling, Arthur climbed to the lantern room alone at 7 o'clock and stood at the pull rope. He stood there for a moment before pulling it. He was not sure why. It was not ceremony. He was not a ceremonial man. Perhaps it was simply that he was aware of it in a way he was not usually aware of it. The rope in his hand, the lamp above him, the water below, the horizon clear and exact in the early light. He pulled the rope. The lamp went out. The last of the beam withdrew. He heard footsteps on the iron stairs below. Not one set, more than one, and a particular quality to the sound. Careful, the way people are careful on unfamiliar stairs, and then less careful, the way they become when the memory of the stairs comes back. Daniel came through the hatch first. He came up and stood at the railing without saying anything, looking out at the water the way he had looked at it from the ledge 30 years ago. The same stillness in his face. Not the grief stillness now. Something else. Something more settled. Iris came up next. She stood close on Arthur's left side, close enough that her shoulder was almost touching his. She had a mug of something. She had apparently brought it up from the kitchen, which required a particular commitment on the iron stairs, and she held it in both hands and looked out at the bay. Marcus came last. He emerged from the hatch and straightened and looked around. Not suspicious, just thorough. Then he came to stand at the railing and looked down at the harbour below, the boats on their moorings, the water moving. Nobody had planned this. Nobody had said, "Meet at the top at 7." Nobody had set an alarm or knocked on a door. They had simply separately woken at the same hour in the rooms they had slept in as children, and come up one after another because it was where Arthur would be. The four of them stood at the railing in the early wind. The light was off. The sea was where it always was. Marcus was looking down at the harbour. After a while he said, "Do you remember the first night we met?" Arthur said, "I remember. You wouldn't look up at me." Marcus said, "I was testing whether you had patience." Arthur said, "And?" Marcus looked at him, a long, straight look. He said, "You passed." Iris had not moved from Arthur's left side. She said, without turning from the water, "Do you know why I finally spoke to you? That morning with the light?" Arthur said, "No." She turned to look at him then. She said, "Because you talked to me like I already understood. Every day for 7 months you talked to me like I was a person who understood things. No one had ever done that before." Arthur looked at her. He did not say anything. There was nothing to add. She had stated it exactly. Any response would have been less than the thing itself. After a moment she looked back at the water. She took a sip from her mug. Daniel had not said anything. He was standing to Arthur's right, slightly apart, looking out at the place where the water met the sky. He had the look of a person composing himself, not with difficulty, but with care. The way you are careful with something that has been folded for a long time and that you do not want to tear. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. He took out a piece of paper. It was old, the kind of old that paper becomes when it has been handled for a very long time. Soft at every crease, the folds worn thin, the edges rounded. It had been folded and unfolded many times, and then folded again and kept. The keeping had changed the texture of it so that it was no longer quite paper, and not quite anything else, just a thing that had been carried for a very long time. He held it out. Arthur took it. He opened it carefully along the creases. A pencil drawing. A lighthouse on a headland above water. The proportions not quite right. The perspective slightly off, in the way of a child's drawing. In the bottom corner, in careful childish printing. For Arthur. Long pause. Music returns very quietly. Arthur held it and looked at it for a long time. Daniel said, "I always thought you'd have thrown it away." Arthur said, "I've kept it in my wallet for 20 years. You didn't know?" Daniel shook his head. Arthur folded the drawing back along its creases, carefully, along the lines that had been made by years of folding, and held it in his hand. A long time passed. The wind came off the water. Daniel said, "Thank you, Dad." His voice was steady. He had prepared himself to say it steadily, and he managed it. And what it cost him to manage it was visible only in the pause afterward, in the way he kept his eyes on the water and his hands on the railing, and did not move for a moment. Arthur looked at him, then at Iris, then at Marcus, then out at the sea. The sea that had taken Eleanor and the child that did not survive. The sea that had taken Patrick Cole's boat and left an 8-year-old boy watching the water every afternoon for 2 weeks. The sea that had carried a small open boat out of wherever it had come from and set it against the rocks in the fog before dawn, with a 6-year-old girl sitting in the bow with her arms around her knees, eyes open, waiting. The sea that Marcus had looked at from a road somewhere and had seen the lighthouse beam and had turned back. Arthur said, "Eleanor would have liked you." Just that, 3 words and a name. He said it the way you say the truest thing, not building to it, not framing it, not looking at anyone when you say it, just saying it. Into the wind, at the water. That afternoon, before they drove away, the children carried the boxes back in. Nobody organized this. Marcus simply picked up one of the stacked boxes from the corner of the front room and took it to the shelf it had come from. Daniel picked up another. Iris began unwrapping the things that had been wrapped in newspaper and setting them back where they had been. It took about 2 hours. They did not ask Arthur where things went. They knew where things went. There was a particular quality to the late afternoon in the cottage then, the quality of a place restored to itself. The shelves, full again, the walls hung again, the kitchen holding its accumulated 30 years of use and adjustment and the lives that had moved through it. They left the way they had arrived, without ceremony, which was not the same as without feeling. Marcus was last. He stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at Arthur. Then at the hook on the wall. He said, "You never took them down." Arthur said, "No." Marcus said, "Good." He went down the path to his car. Arthur stood in the doorway and watched the 3 cars go down the gravel road, one after another, until the sound of them was gone and the road was quiet again. He stood there a moment longer. Then he turned and looked at the hook. 3 small coats. The navy blue anorak faded, the red double-breasted with the mismatch button, the olive green zip-up with the white stripe, dusty, worn thin at the elbows, too small for anyone now, no explanation for them, and none needed. He left them where they were. He went to the kitchen and poured the last of the afternoon coffee, cold by now, which did not matter, and sat at the table with the log open and the pencil in his hand. He wrote the date. He wrote the barometric pressure, the wind direction, the state of the water, calm, visibility good, no fog, horizon clear. He paused. In the space below the standard entries, where sometimes he wrote a note, he wrote this: "Children went home this afternoon." He looked at the line for a moment. Then, below it, he wrote one more. Coats still on the hook. He closed the log. He put the pencil back in the tin. Outside, the sun was getting low over the pines, the light going gold and flat across the water, the way it does in April on the Maine coast, briefly cleanly, before the dark comes in. At 6 o'clock, he went up the stairs and pulled the rope. The lamp began to turn.